Hey everybody, hope everybody's doing well. Um, Back for another video. As I mentioned in a previous video, I'm going to try and stick with the theme, and that's geography. Like I said, big fan of geography. So I'm going to talk about one of those states that I mentioned last week um, that borders New York, and that's Massachusetts. It also happens to be the only other state that I've lived in. Spent the first 5 years of my life living in Massachusetts, Pittsfield, Massachusetts. So I'm kind of partial to Massachusetts. Much like New York, it's one of the 13 original colonies. I won't run through the whole list because I'm trying to keep my videos a little shorter. My last two have been averaging 14 minutes, and that's a pretty long time to be listening to me talk solid. So we'll try and cut down on that. Um, it became a state in 1788. It was the sixth state to become an actual state. First one was Delaware. They have it right on their license plate. First state. After that was Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, and then Massachusetts. And New York was sixth. But it was all within about a year of each other. So that's all part of those 13 original colonies, and they all kind of just became states one right after another. So uh, I keep saying the state of Massachusetts. Massachusetts is actually a commonwealth. There's Massachusetts and three other states, what we call states, that call themselves commonwealths. That would be Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. And basically, all a commonwealth was it was a name for like a political community that got together and formed for the common good. So that's where Commonwealth comes from. So Massachusetts is 15th in population and it's 44th in area. So, it's up in the top half there or so of population, but it's pretty small, just outside the top five or six smallest states. So, but even though it's a pretty small state, it borders five states: New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, of course, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. And it doesn't border Maine. People look at a map, see Maine right above Massachusetts, but New Hampshire kind of sneaks in there, even though Maine at one point was not an original 13 colony because it was all part of Massachusetts. So, uh, the Commonwealth, the nickname is the Bay State, uh, mainly because its eastern borders along the Atlantic Ocean and it's got a lot of large bays. Massachusetts Bay, Cape Cod Bay, which is right there in between the mainland and Cape Cod. So, as I mentioned, it does border the Atlantic Ocean. It also has some other famous kind of water features, much like New York. It's got Boston Harbor. There's the Connecticut River runs through it. There's the Charles River. The Charles River is a very famous river, runs north of Boston. Um, and once a year, they have this big boat race there. They call it the Head of the Charles, and all these boats get together and they race. And colleges and other high schools go over there, and they all kind of race against each other and stuff like that. So, and along with some other lakes and things like that, there's one very famous pond. It's called Walden Pond, and it was a guy a couple hundred years ago, Henry David Thoreau, wrote about living near this pond in a cabin for a couple years, and it's pretty famous, and a lot of people like to go visit there because you can go visit there. So, uh, Massachusetts, much like New York's got part of the Appalachian mountain chain in there. The Berkshires are probably the most famous, and they're like right up against the western part of the state, right over here, about 40 minutes or so from Albany. You can go over to the Berkshires, Berkshire County, and while they don't have a lot of other mountains, the farther east they go, they do have a pretty famous rock, probably the most famous rock I can think of, Plymouth Rock. That's over south of Boston over there. So, but Massachusetts, it's like people landed in Plymouth and people came from England here pretty early. Wasn't the first, but they were here pretty early, and people started to settle all around there and kind of spread out. So they were pretty instrumental in in the Revolutionary War and all that. Um, they've had four U.S. presidents from Massachusetts. That puts them fourth. So they had John Adams, who was the third president, and they had John Quincy Adams, who was John Adams' son. They also had John Kennedy. And then they did have George Herbert Walker Bush, so the older of the Bush. So that broke the streak of three Johns there. So those other states with more presidents, Virginia actually has 8. Ohio has 7, and New York is third with 5. With Martin Van Buren, who grew up right around here, who had a house around here you can go visit. Millard Fillmore, who I have to be honest with, I don't really know much about Millard Fillmore. They also had Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and then our 5th one from New York was Donald Trump. So we pulled ahead of Massachusetts there in the last election. So, as I did just mention, Boston is the capital city and the largest city. It's actually the 21st most populous city in the country. The top 5 being New York. Everyone would probably guess that. Most people would probably guess LA next and Chicago third. They've been probably the top 3 for a while. 4th is Houston, and then 5th is Phoenix. So a couple down there in the south, which have been rising up the list over the past few years or so. But Boston, like I said, has been around for a long time, and as such, it's been they've had a lot of firsts. They've done a lot of things there. They had the first public park called Boston Commons. And that was way back in 1634. They also had the first public school. It's called the Boston Latin School. People spoke Latin back then, not so much anymore. Unless you're going to be a doctor, you need to know your Latin. But that was 1635. They also had the first subway system. I don't think it was very long, the Tremont Street subway, but that was 1897. But as I said, Boston's a pretty famous city, famous for its hospitals. They got the Brigham and Women's Hospital, the Dana-Farber Cancer Clinic, Boston Medical Center. They're also famous. They have a lot of real high quality and good universities. They're Harvard, MIT, Holy Cross is near there, Boston University, Boston College. There's Williams College out in Berkshire County, a whole bunch of places. And much like the whole area and Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Boston was pretty instrumental in the beginning of the American Revolution. Many of you guys will recognize, the Boston Massacre occurred there, the Boston Tea Party, the Battle of Lexington and Concord was just outside of Boston, and that was pretty much where the American Revolution started. Paul Revere was from Boston, where he made his ride. He's got a house there which you can go visit. It's kind of neat and everything like that. So there's a lot of history. There's the public gardens there. There's Faneuil Hall, which is a large marketplace where a lot of the patriots gathered when they were talking about starting some trouble with England. There's the Freedom Trail, which is a collection of museums, churches, meeting houses, burial grounds, a lot of cemeteries right in the city, parks, a ship, all these things. And it's all like this trail that you can walk along. And it all kind of gives you a history of what happened in and around Boston during the Revolutionary War. They've got that ship I just mentioned is the U.S. Constitution, also known as Old Ironside. It's a wooden-hulled ship with 3 big masts. I think it's a frigate, and it's still the world's oldest commissioned naval vessel afloat. So if they wanted to use it, I think they could probably sail it out. I don't know if it would work that well, but they could if they wanted to. So like I said, a lot of history in and around Boston. There's also a lot of entertaining and fun things to do around Boston. Boston does have 5 professional sports teams, basically 1 in each of the 4 major sports. They also have soccer. They've got the Red Sox and baseball, which are probably the most a beloved sports team in Boston. Everybody loves the Red Sox. They have the Bruins, who play hockey. They have the Celtics, who play basketball. They have the New England Revolution, which plays soccer. And then they have the Patriots. Um, Patriots have done pretty well the last few years. Some of that's probably because they don't like to adhere to the rules a lot. But anyway, they did. They have won a few Super Bowls. Um, the Red Sox, who I mentioned, play in Fenway Park, and that is like one of the oldest parks in the country still, where they play professional baseball. I think that and Wrigley Field in Chicago were built, I think, in the same year, 1918. So they're over 100 years old. Um, Other sports in and around there, I mentioned the boat race, on the Charles River. They also have the Boston Marathon, which is pretty famous. Lots of people come from all over the world to run in the Boston Marathon. So whether it's entertainment, entertainment. They've also got like the Boston Pops is a very famous orchestra that plays there. There's out in the western part of the state. There's Tanglewood, which is sort of like our Saratoga Performing Arts Center. Play outside, and lots of musical bands like to go there. Also, over in the western part of the state is Mass Mocha. Some of you guys remember going to visit Mass Mocha. It's a big art museum. It used to be a factory back 150 years ago, and they've turned it into a big, massive art museum. And that's kind of neat to go walk around. If you're over in Boston, you've got lots of museums and things like that. You got the Children's Museum, which my youngest daughter got lost in once years ago. You got the New England Aquarium, which I think Wildwood used to take a trip to the aquarium. Maybe we will someday, but that's kind of a neat place to visit. So all in all, lots of things to do in and around Boston, lots of things to do over in Massachusetts. Like I said, I'm pretty partial to that as my state of my birth. So if you get a chance, go over and visit some of these places, do some of these things over there. Right now, Massachusetts, much like New York, is a good state to visit. There's some that aren't, but Massachusetts is a good state to visit. So just make sure if you do go, you be careful and be safe, and take care. We'll talk to you again next week. See ya.